G'day YouTube, warbles on a lot here. Those of you who've been paying attention to the channel will be aware that I've recently made the switch from a single string bobbin to a two-string bobbin. So instead of having two cutting strings on my head, I've got four. Having amassed something around 130 hours experience with the two-string bobbin on this Tanaka 500 TBC, I can say with authority that perhaps 1 string in 10 will break off both. Perhaps 20%. Let's call it 20%. Probably 50% of the strings, just as it's getting so short that you have to use really high revs to get sufficient tip speed on the short string to be able to cut the vegetation, 1 string breaks, and at that point it's actually more fuel efficient to stop and change strings than it is to keep going spinning one little short string. So that's maybe 70% of your outcomes, leaving maybe 30% of strings where both of them stay attached, but they get to be sufficiently short that that's that point there, that wear point, that wear point, that wear point, that wear point. When you've got such a short string, it's just not worth continuing on with. So you maybe 30% get down to that point. And depending on how many rocks and how many sticks one is brush cutting around, you get a different number of strings to the hour kind of thing. Using a two-string bobbin, brush cutting in here to compost the grass and put more moisture into the topsoil and have a wet layer underneath the dead Melaleuca alternifolia, aka tea tree. It's not uncommon to start off with a full tank of fuel and 1 new string on the bobbin and 9 spare new strings in the pocket. And at the end of an hour and a half, or hour and 18 minutes, at 3 minutes to change each string and an hour of cutting time, you've still got fuel in the tank, you're absolutely knackered, and you've got to stop because you've used all your strings. You can use 9 strings an hour. Particularly if it's really hot and you're really sweaty, or if you're really tired, or if you're in a bad mood. It's easy with the two-string or single-string two-ended spool. It's really easy to use too much power. And I think that's because the aerodynamic load of only 2 string ends is not sufficient to limit the RPM. So you get the strings spinning too fast, so to speak, and then when you hit an obstacle, they've got sufficient energy in the tip of the over-revving string to break. So they wear a bit faster because they're going too fast. If you're paying more attention, you're exercising better control of the throttle, better RPM control. You're only applying the power when you're going into thicker and stronger vegetation, particularly when cutting quote clean grass, unquote, with not much in the way of rocks and sticks and obstacles, it's entirely possible to cut for an hour and only use 2 or 3 strings. If you're on stuff like this, for example. But that is the gap of wear caused on the strings on that spool, which was incurred in about 5 minutes, I think. If you're really keen, go back to the previous video and have a look at the time counter between when I started cutting with the single string head for a 2-string head. If you talk about how many strings, you're talking about how many strings stick out of the bobbin. If you talk about how many strings are in the head, you're talking about how many pieces of string you have to fit into it. So yeah, single string, 2-string head. Confuzzling. So I would suspect that after 10 to 15 minutes in that kind of country, perhaps half that amount of time, perhaps in 7 minutes time, the string would have broken one side off or encountered obstacles which had broken 2 sides off. So the record is 10 strings in an hour. Let's say 5 strings in an hour is a really good day in country like this. That's probably a fair estimate, allowing for all contingencies, not cherry picking from either end of the bell curve. Say 5 strings an hour. Oh, hello. With all this rain, the forest has regained its spiders. Now. There, Spidey. Tracky mean incisor to go with the spider. Right, forgive the segue. Shiny, shiny spider. Back to the main track. And perhaps that would be a representative hour's string usage or wastage, because the bit of the string that comes out after being used, that's the bit that there is no actual use for. And these strings, if we were to put some numbers on the matter, 8.5 inches to the midpoint. So the midpoint's a little bit off. Pretty much 17.5 inches, which is 44.4 centimetres for the metricated amongst you. And because of the reduced distance between there and there, as well as there and there, compared to the distance from there to there, and from there to there, because you effectively cut out about an inch on each side, it did indeed turn out that when I put these standard length strings onto the 4-string hub or 2-string hub, 4-ended hub, that's a problem in nomenclature. Double-string hub, how's that? Covers it all, doesn't it? It's double whatever the normal setup used to be. Right, so when we put the normal strings on the double string hub, they turned out to be about 1 inch too long at each end. So the strings on the single string are 2 inches longer than the strings on the double string. So if you save 1 inch off each end, you wind up with a 2-inch saving. So if you're in average country and you're having a bad day, or if you're in bad country and having a good day, you're going to be using maybe 6 strings per hour. And these strings are going to add up to a total of 12 inches more material than if we were talking about 6 strings which were cut for the proper length for the double string bobbin. You're literally saving 80% of an entire string every 6 strings you use. Meaning that if you use 6 strings in the real world, you've technically, theoretically, only used 5.2 strings, because you've saved 0.8 of a string by each string being 20% shorter. Maths, you see, maths. Not actual arithmetic, simply maths. And it's a good baseline to start out with, because I have done what you might call a real world test. And what I've found is that in the worst country that I've got, comprising waist-high vegetation with lots of windfall and sticks, with the idea being to follow the pipeline and clear a track, the better to walk 450 metres downhill to the firefighting pump at the dam. So clearing 2 metres or so each side of the pipeline, allowing for excessiveness, various deviations to go around plants that shouldn't actually be cut down, and the fact that the 450 metres is a bit of a map-based figure of speech. There's about 480 metres of pipeline. So let's say 2 metres each side, sometimes 3, roughly 1,000 square metres. Beginning with the set of strings that had already done 10 minutes. They did 10 minutes and they were getting short enough that it was a pain in the ass to spin the head fast enough to let 4 little short strings work. So I changed them, and changing a 2-string head out versus changing a 4-string head out, a single string head out, it's 5 minutes for the job instead of 3 minutes for the job. You just have to stop, put the thing down on its side, pull out your pliers, make up 2 strings, because you have to do a little bit of work with the pliers in the middle. Extract the 2 strings that have had their time, install the new ones in there. That it takes 5 minutes to do 2 strings, and it takes 3 minutes to do 1 string, because you've got to do a lot of the stuff once, pretty much. Adding an extra string doesn't double the time. You don't look at 6 minutes for the 2 strings. So what it turned out was I then got 20 minutes out of the next set of strings, and then I got 20 minutes out of the next set of strings. And what you saw back there on the machine, this set of strings, it's actually done 10 minutes of engine time, and it hasn't actually worn that much, perhaps because the vegetation down near the dam is a bit softer, and you know, for whatever reason, these are about that much longer than was the string ends on the first set, and that first set of strings had already put in 10 minutes in fairly thickly sticky country, cutting down chest to head high vegetation, even to the point of putting it through some flax lily just to test it and see that two string heads work. Dual string, and normally I use a blade to cut flax lilies because they wear away the end of your string and they wind themselves around the axle of your bobbin, and if you've got string on, yeah, flax lily is really difficult to cut. But what I can say with a fair degree of certainty is that with the dual string bobbin, with 4 ends sticking out to whack the weeds with, you're going to use 3 sets of strings per hour on the worst country with the only just barely cuttable vegetation, and never at any time during the 1,000 square meters or so did I have one end of the string break off. In an hour of cutting on the worst country that I've got, I used 6 of the shortened strings. So one might surmise, isn't that a pretty little orchid, that when brush cutting in somewhat less extreme country, one might find it's fairly normal to only go through 4 strings per hour instead of 6. And if you're really careful, on a bit of properly stick-picked country, might only use 2 strings per hour in the dual string bobbin. More stick picking to go. So if you add in the fact that you're never going to get out there and brush cut for 5 minutes and break one end of the string off flush at the bobbin, meaning that you really have to stop what you're doing and spend 3 minutes swapping out what's essentially a completely out of balance ruined string, because you can use a one-ended string if it's really short. If it's a long one-ended string, yeah, it's going to shake the shit out of your machine. No fun at all. And at the end of the hour worth of engine run time for the 3 sets of strings, after an hour the engine was still running, so there was still fuel in the tank. So I'm going to say there's probably not a great deal of fuel burn difference between running a dual string hub at a slightly lower RPM and tickling the throttle up and down all over the rev band, trying to keep this thing from overspinning while maintaining sufficient momentum to be able to do the job. And there's none of this shit going on. And there's none of this shit going on. And there's none of this shit going on. And yeah, one final thing. When everything goes right for your old single string bobbin, and you get to use the string all the way down to the point where it needs to be swapped out because it's getting too short and having to spin too fast due to string tip abrasion having created a feathery edge. If we lay this out and measure it, we get 11.5 inches. Left over from a 17-inch string. And I think this one's probably going to be a little bit worse. "13 inches out of a 17-inch string. So when everything goes right, you lose 12 or 13 inches. 33 or 30 centimetres out of your 44 centimetre string. Bit sad, isn't it? Whereas these are all pretty much the same length, because you stop using them when they get too short. Let's try that again. It slipped. Nine 3/4 inches out of a 15-inch string. So you actually get to use 5 1/4 inches of each shorter string rather than 4 1/2 inches of the longer strings. So we get 0.75 of an inch of string divided by 4.5 inches, 16% difference. Going by the numbers, these strings, 16% less is wasted in the central, got to have the hub in order to swing the tip effect. And meanwhile, each one of these strings is 11% shorter than are the strings on the single string hub. 16% less wasted in the center of each string, and the strings are 11% shorter anyway. So I'm going to say that this double spool is going to actually consume 27% less, 120 thousandths of an inch, 3mm brush cutter line. Gotta say, it took me a while to figure it out, but that is my conclusion. Single spool is good. Double spool is 27% better. Quod erit demonstrandum, as them there ancient roamings would have spoken in the original Latino. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.